Assalamu alaikum, or peace be upon you all, and welcome to this evening's talk entitled What Happens Next? The Spiritual Afterlife in Islam. This is the first event of Explore Islam Week 2014 that is run by Cambridge University's very own Islamic Society. Before we start this evening, I'd like to invite Hamza to recite a few Quranic verses from Surah Fussilat.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن الذين قالوا ربنا الله ثم استقاموا تتنزل عليهم الملائكة ألا تخافوا ولا تحزنوا وأبشروا بالجنة التي كنتم توعدون نحن أولياؤكم في الحياة الدنيا وفي الآخرة ولكم فيها ما تشتهي أنفسكم ولكم فيها ما تدعون نزلا من غفور رحيم ومن أحسن قولا ممن دعا إلى الله وعمل صالحا وقال إنني من المسلمين ولا تستوي الحسنة ولا السيئة ادفع بالتي هي أحسن فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة كأنه ولي حميم وما يلقاها إلا الذين صبروا وما يلقاها إلا ذو حظ عظيم. Which obviously means, but behold, as for those who say, our sustainer is God, and then steadfastly pursue the right way, upon them do angels often descend, saying, Fear not and grieve not, but receive the glad tidings of that paradise which has been promised to you. We are close unto you in the life of this world, and will be so in the life to come. And in that life to come you shall have all that your souls may desire, and in it you shall have all that you ever prayed for, as a ready welcome from him who is much forgiving, a dispenser of grace. And who could be better of speech than he who calls his fellow men unto God, and does what is just and right, and says, Verily, I am of those who have surrendered themselves to God. But since good and evil cannot be equal, repel your evil with something that is better, and lo, he between whom and yourself was enmity may then become as though he had always been unto thee a true friend. Yet to achieve this is not given to any but those who are wont to be patient in adversity. It is not given to any but those endowed with the greatest good fortune.
Thank you very much, Hamza, for that beautiful recitation. The translation can also be found in the handouts handed to you under your seats, I think. I would like to introduce Ali, a second-year medic who will talk briefly about his personal experience of being a Muslim.
Thank you, Shanaz, and Assalamu alaikum to you all. I've been asked to give a brief talk about what it's like to be a Muslim in Cambridge. And obviously this is from my own personal experience, but I imagine all my friends here will share pretty much the same experiences as well. I guess the first thing to say really is that being a Muslim in Cambridge, you become very familiar with all the halal takeaway shops in and around Cambridge, which is really nice. Like, you get to meet your ISoc friends in there, have a chat after football, that kind of thing, which is quite cool. You also get access to the ISoc prayer room in Sidgwick site, which is a nice place where they hold like talks and sort of events in the evenings. But what I find to be the best part about it is that in the mornings, after your 8:45 lecture, you can make yourself a cup of tea, sort of in that gap, and sort of chat to people, and it's a really nice sort of social atmosphere. Jokes aside though, I think before coming to university, I certainly felt this, and I'm sure a lot of my friends did as well, that you sort of worry about whether it's going to be possible to balance what it means to be a Muslim with what it's like to be at university, specifically at Cambridge. So I personally was quite worried about the whole drinking culture thing, the fact that I was worried about not being able to make friends if I didn't drink. But when I got here, I found that everyone was very accepting of the fact that we didn't drink. There's no real pressure to do so, and I think in general it's really cool that you can sort of make friends with people in college and people outside of college and that kind of stuff. And the fact that you're a Muslim doesn't really impact upon that relationship at all. Like, at the end of the day, I don't think anyone really cares whether you're a Muslim or whether you're a Christian. They just care about who you are, which sounds a bit weird, but I think that's quite a nice thing about being a Muslim in Cambridge. What else? It's really nice that we've got the Islamic Society and the Pakistan Society and that kind of thing to, so you get to meet like-minded people from different colleges, from different subjects, from different walks of life, but in the end you all share that same sort of fundamental identity of being a Muslim. And that's one of the really great things about Cambridge, is that we have such a strong community within the Islamic Society, and we have all these talks and all these events where we do get to know all these people. And yeah, so I think it's mostly down to the awesome people that we have in these societies that makes it quite easy to be a Muslim in Cambridge. Like, the ideologies of Islam in university don't really have to clash per se. They can complement each other. It is quite easy to find that balance between enjoying university life while not compromising what it means to be a Muslim. And I'm hugely thankful to everyone in ISoc and all my friends who make that possible. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Ali. Now, we are very privileged to have Timothy Winter to speak to us about the nature and purpose of this world, as well as the importance of the afterlife in Islam. Timothy Winter, otherwise known as Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad, is an internationally renowned scholar, the Dean of Cambridge Muslim College, and was voted Britain's most influential Muslim thinker. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Timothy Winter.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm this time of the week definitely off duty, so this will be a rather impressionistic and informal kind of presentation. Perhaps one place to start would be to reflect on the fact that inevitably our theology, our way of trying to systematize the data of revelation, is always in dialogue with the age and with the paradigms of the age, the science of the age, the philosophy of the age. And whereas in the Middle Ages, when the great Kalam articulations of our doctrine were created, giving rise to the texts and the commentaries which are still widely followed in our madrasas today, the medieval paradigm was essentially a kind of late Aristotelian idea of the soul and the conceptions of human becoming, and ideas of what one might make of the scriptural descriptions of what lies beyond the veil of death were necessarily time-bound. So I don't begin from the presumption that we are in any way bound by classical madrasa formulations of these relationalities. What I think we can take helpfully from the Middle Ages is a sense that this is, of all of the areas of Muslim discourse, whether it be law or spirituality or history or any of the other things that we've done, the one where indeterminacy has been seen as most necessary, but where the importance of the issue is inescapable. After all, eternity occupies quite a large percentage of our existence, does it not? If the propositions contained in Scripture are true, then we need to take very seriously the prospect of eternal life. It's important, but it's difficult, because what happens after we breathe our last is acknowledged to be something that is related to the mystery of consciousness, the spirit, the soul itself. And in that famous Quranic ayah, even the Holy Prophet is told that he doesn't know the full story about that. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. They ask you about the spirit. Say, the spirit is of God's command, and of knowledge you've been given but little. So when we look at these classical debates and try to figure out whether they still work for us, about whether the depictions of events, figures, moments, narratives in the next world and in heaven and hell are figurative or metaphorical or analogous or literal, and our religions have occupied very many spaces along that spectrum, we need to bear in mind the fact that they are to be experienced by the human subject, which is something which we don't understand very well. If we're talking about personal survival after death, we are speaking in terms of speculations, possible analogies, something that probably is a further form of detachment than, for instance, the relationship between a dream state and a waking state. And indeed, we have this narrative, sometimes attributed to the Holy Prophet himself, الناس نيام فإذا ماتوا انتبهوا. People are asleep. When they die, they wake up. And if you've read Ghazali's autobiography, for instance, you'll see him reflecting very much in a most Cartesian way about what he can actually know. Is it only his consciousness, and can he even trust these apparent first-order truths supplied to him by the fact of consciousness itself? How does he know that his current way of processing information about the world is not as malformed as is our way of processing information when we are in a dream state or in a state of intoxication or some other form of altered consciousness? How can we know that? So we've always had, I think, as part of the wisdom of our theological tradition, the awareness that we are speaking in terms of approximations, and that a certain literalism that likes to see in the data of revelation a kind of list of things that we can put in our calendars and conjure up in our mind's eye is not, in fact, what we are looking at. There's even an athar narrated from Ibn Abbas, radiallahu anh, which says, in the next world, none of the things of this world will exist, only their names will be there. And when we hear about the fruits of paradise, for instance, even the Quran says, وَأُتُوا بِهِ مُتَشَابِهًا, they will be given the like thereof. Clearly, the thought pictures are proposing something that is an indication, an inspiration, a pointing towards a reality rather than a kind of HD plasma screen image of what it's going to be like. And that's not an eccentric view, that's a standard one. But what is it that perceives? So any discussion of the next world, as we consider it, has to begin with some sort of reflection on what we are. What is the human subject that will pass through death? What part of us can survive death? What is just part of the brain and will pass away as the brain rots? And what is taken to be part of the immortal mystery of consciousness itself? Islamic civilization has necessarily wrestled with this. It's the beginning point, I guess, of all philosophy, written above the Delphic oracle, after all. Know thyself. Perhaps a principle not widely followed amongst modern philosophers, but certainly traditional philosophy always assumed that you had to have a sense of your selfhood and even purify the modalities of your selfhood before you could make dispassionate and reliable choices between different theories. That's fallen out of fashion to some extent, partly because of the cloudiness that surrounds the whole idea of human selfhood. But for traditional man, this was important, knowing the self. What is the self? What am I? One of the strange paradoxes about modernity, and it may even turn out to be a fatal one, is that if we take its beginnings to be, I suppose, with Descartes, sitting in his room in Amsterdam and closing his eyes and wondering what he could truly know, and deciding that he could only really know that there was a self which knew other things. Interpretation was possibly unreliable, but he was certain that he had a sense of self. And the whole Enlightenment process that took the emphasis from value and human becoming and the source of meaning from the divine and placed it in the human being, the human subject, that seems to have drawn to a close. If you look at the works of serious philosophers about the self and about human becoming, you'll see a strange despair almost in terms of our ability to define whether we represent a self at all. It seems to be the most obvious thing. Descartes certainly thought it was, but it seems to be not quite so simple. Look at, for instance, Heidegger, perhaps the most influential philosopher of the 20th century. His great work, Being and Time, very innovative and brilliant in many ways, proposes what is really important about the study of anything is being, and being constitutes that strange space which we know to exist between the self and the act or the object. I perceive things or do things, and there is something which is a field in which those things, those perceptions or those actions actually take place. What is the gulf between those two things? That is being itself. That is the great mystery. We know it exists because we can differentiate between the self and the object, the self's attentions or actions. But what is this space? Well, being and time is made up largely of a set of often quite disconnected reflections on the modality of the human perception of what it is to operate in that space and to have agency and to have perception. His great conclusion is that there is no single human modality of being or of engaging with being. Instead, when we talk about the I, we talk about a series of ways of being. Do they add up to a single self? Heidegger thinks probably not. If they do, that self is just another of these multiple modalities. And this is quite characteristic of the way in which the moderns tend to reduce consciousness to a series of quite disconnected moments of brain activity. When I wake up in the morning, is it the same self that went to sleep the night before? Well, a lot of neuroscientists, and certainly a lot of philosophers would say that's a meaningless superstition. The brain is coming back to life again, rather like switching on your computer, but it's not the same mysterious, mystical entity that suddenly comes to life again that is genuinely in continuity. No, it's just the brain doing its thing. Some of the more recent neuroscientists and philosophers even propose that we don't have such a thing as will, and that will and taking decisions is simply a story that the frontal cortex of the brain creates for us after we have performed actions that are in fact fully automated. And there is a certain irony in the modern world that on the one hand says man is the measure of all things. Human freedom, human rights, volition, being yourself, discovering yourself, expressing yourself, in most ways these are admirable things, has to contend with a philosophical and a scientific model that isn't really sure what the self is anyway. And much of the precariousness, you might say, of the current international order seems to be based on the fact that we create these huge superstructures of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so many other worthy documents which have followed them, but without having a consensual or philosophically defensible, let alone a scientifically verifiable model of what is a human being. What is the human self? What is the individual? It's one of the strange things about our culture. So whereas in the Middle Ages, Muslims were able to benefit from learning from other civilizations which had elaborate definitions of human selfhood based on the assumption that the soul was there, a discarnate property that either constituted ourselves or was superadded to ourselves, but certainly existed and was certainly going to be eternal, whether it was the translations of yoga texts from Patanjali that were done into Arabic in the 9th and the 10th century, or whether it was Aristotle's De Anima and De Memoria, which went into Arabic slightly earlier. The other civilizations that produced the scientific and the philosophical template with which Muslims worked, with the great science of the day, assumed the reality of human subjectivity and of selfhood, and that consciousness is not just a game retroactively played by the synapses of the brain, but that there actually is something within us. There is a self, and when you speak to somebody else, there is actually another person there. It's not just another automated aspect of an entirely materialistic universe. So this is a problem for us, and of course modernity is a very caustic, acidic place in which to do theology, because really it's constituted by its rejection of traditional religion. But nonetheless, one thing we can say is that partly because modernity has not come up with a scientific or a philosophical notion of human subjectivity or of selfhood, we're free to still be theologians. The scriptural or the even medieval models have not been particularly refuted. Modernity is arguing amongst itself. And indeed, we find, and you can do this quite easily by looking at what's happening in the popular culture, find that there is still, despite science and Darwin as the regnant paradigms, a huge interest in human selfhood and in supernatural phenomena and in life after death. Many more people believe in personal survival after death than actually consider themselves to be members of religions. And in some ways, for instance, belief in reincarnation, that's actually growing. So this is not a completely anti-spiritual age, but it is an age which, sometimes I suspect for good reasons, has chosen to turn its back on the established monotheisms. So we find, for instance, huge interest in certain phenomena that are so regularly reported that we need to think about whether they might be true or what they mean for ourselves as Muslims. So, for instance, near-death experiences. This is not just a few anecdotes, but again and again in different cultures we find people who are pronounced to be clinically dead, having been resuscitated, reporting all kinds of interesting phenomena, such as a tunnel of light and seeing relatives, and there's Auntie Alison, and it's all great. They never seem to see the infernal regions. It's all kind of nice, but it's so regularly reported that we need to think about whether that is just a strange trick that the dying brain performs for evolutionary reasons that are very far from clear, or whether there is some grounds, as many reasonable people, including many scientists, have accepted, although not the majority, for asserting that science cannot prove or disprove, verify or falsify the existence of a consciousness that is not simply reducible to the cells of the body. It's outside the compass of scientific competence. Science can't pass judgment there. But human experience, human intuition, often has a richness and a depth and an intimacy to it that can't quite be accounted for by even the best neuroscience. There's something more going on than is dreamt of in your philosophy. So we have all kinds of interesting things. The report from a woman in America 20 years ago, she wrote it down in a book, where she was pronounced to be, temperature was reduced artificially so that a particular surgical procedure could take place, and her eyes were covered with bandages, and afterwards this actually fairly secular person accurately described what had taken place in the operating theatre, including the shape of the instruments, and it was so uncannily like what had actually happened that this became something of a sensation, a publishing sensation as well. And that's one case, and a particularly verifiable case, because it took place under clinical conditions, and the surgeons were there and they verified it. Subsequently, Pam Reynolds was her name, the Pam Reynolds case, you can look it up. And there have been many others. Now these don't prove anything decisively, because to be scientific facts, many existing assumptions about the nature of the world would have to be radically revised, and because it's very difficult to replicate them experimentally. There are so many cases like that that many people are still quite convinced that we are not just a bag of protoplasm, the result of a billion years of the operation of the selfish gene. But there's something in us, something in the mystery of consciousness that science can't apprehend. Out-of-body experiences, another example, much more common. Apparently 1 in 10 people in the UK has had an out-of-body experience. Frequently these are associated with moments of trauma, with sickness, traffic accidents, and so forth. And usually the pattern is very similar, that the patient observes their own body from outside. And I've myself not had these experiences, but talked to people who have had them, sometimes quite repeatedly. And again, it does seem to be a common phenomenon. I knew a South African advertising executive, a very worldly guy, who said that sometimes he would wake up in the morning and look down on his own body. And the first few times this happened, he was frightened, and then he got used to it and just sunk down into his body again. He had no particular sort of theological conclusions to draw from this. He just reported it as part of his experience of life. Another case I dealt with, a girl up in Newcastle from a Muslim background who had had a very close encounter in a traffic accident and was almost dead, and as part of the post-trauma recovery, regularly had these out-of-body experiences, and again would see herself from above, and she would sink down into her body. And as a quite secularized person, she found it difficult to process this. I talked to her, to her boyfriend, and what we finally did was to suggest that she resumed the practice of the prayer, because the prayer is an ideal instrument for reconnecting body, mind and spirit, because it's very embodied, but it's a spiritual exercise. So she did that, and she said it did actually help. So many people have either had such experiences or have met people who have had such experiences, and although they put together cannot decisively prove something, they do give us reason, I think, to assume that the scientific paradigm may not have yet encompassed the totality of what's out there in the universe. So ours is a strange culture. On the one hand, not really believing in the soul, but very many people really interested in these phenomena that only make sense if you do believe that there is a discarnate entity which is ultimately constitutive of what we are. So, if we look now at the Islamic understanding of all this, bearing in mind the points that I made at the outset, which is that these issues which are classically regarded as questions of ma'ad, and if you look at the classical texts of Muslim theology, you'll see that they usually have three parts. There's a metaphysical part, and then there's a bit about prophecy and scripture, and then there's the bit about life after death. That the rules of argumentation and proof, which are strictly rational and rationalizing in the areas on metaphysics, how you prove the existence of God, how you determine the nature and relationality of the divine attributes, hundreds of pages of rather dry metaphysics, that's in the first section of our Kalam manuals. And the final section is not demonstrated rationally at all, except insofar as certain rational objections to the possibility of life after death, resurrection, heaven and hell might be there, and these objections are refuted. Essentially, lists of arguments against materialists, against believers in tanasukh, reincarnation, against people who believe in a purely figurative or impersonal survival after death, sort of Platonic model. It's essentially polemical, but what our theology has never claimed is that you can prove life after death, or heaven and hell, or any of these otherworldly realities through reason. We've never claimed that you can do that. The earlier things, the metaphysical things, the necessity for prophethood, all of that we have developed elaborate arguments for, but the other things are known as sam'iyat. This is the term that we use, as sam'iyat. Sometimes this area in the Kalam manual is called ma'ad, the place of return, literally, is also referred to as the sam'iyat. In other words, things that are heard, known, as the Latins would put it, as ex auditu. They're heard. Heard in what? In sama, in revelation. So it only becomes binding or meaningful to believe in such things through access to revelation. So our theology has this interesting bifurcation, but again it's part of the realism, I think, of our tradition. Certain things cannot be verified through reasoned polemic logic and debate, and if you try to prove such things with a materialist or a logician, you simply won't get very far, because they're using a different vocabulary. They don't have access to this additional superadded metaphysical truth that comes through infinity itself, eternity itself, taking the initiative and actually lifting the veil and showing us certain things. It's also the case that these are the hardest things to believe in. Sa'd al-Tustari, one of the great early Sufis, said, أول شكوك العبد في أحوال القيامة. The first of a believer's doubts concerns the resurrection and the circumstances of the resurrection. Easier to believe in God, the omnipotent, the almighty, the merciful, prophecy, holy books, time, space. That's easier than to believe in this extraordinary saga at the end of time of the angel blowing on the last trumpet, the resurrection, the quick and the dead appearing mustered before God and dispatched to heaven or hell. That's harder for the mind to understand. So we've always been aware, and those who are in pastoral vocations will know this, that tends to be where people get twitchy first of all in religion, because it's completely outside our experience and doesn't seem to have any support outside revelation itself. So the other thing that we insist on here is that many of these issues which are ghaibiyat, unseen, intangible things that we analogize about, have to be the legitimate subject of difference of opinion. So, for instance, what a soul can do when it's dead and in the grave, everybody's really interested. You know, from spiritualists on Newmarket Road, they have a church and they talk to their relatives, they have seances. And if you're on the Sidgwick site, Henry Sidgwick, after whom the Sidgwick site is named, irony of ironies, all those secular humanistic faculties there, very keen on spiritualism and contacting his departed beloved, that was back in the Victorian period. Everybody really wants to know. But again, the ulama, in my experience, will say there's certain generic things which can be known, but exactly where the soul is when it's dead, in the grave, in paradise, in some place, in Aliyyin. Ibn al-Qayyim gives 7 different interpretations as to where the soul is between death and resurrection. If it's a blessed soul or an evil soul, there are hadiths about how that interspace between death and resurrection is a foretaste of the final destination of that soul. Rawdatun min Riyad al-Jannah, or Hufratun min Hufar al-Nar, a garden of paradise or a pit of hell. But where it is problematic. It does have a where, but in a sense that's probably going to puzzle us, because it's the ruh, and the ruh does strange things in time and space. So, and this is important to remember, because very often Muslims get into polemical and sectarian arguments based on ghaibiyat. Is it possible for such and such a person who's dead to pray for me? No, it's shirk, haram, kufr. No, it's obligatory and I saw him in a dream, and etc. And we start fighting. If you talk to the traditional scholars, they'll say you don't really know what any of that is, just respect the other person's opinion. As long as that opinion is backed up by a substantial number of ulama, give them the benefit of the doubt, because there's no way you're going to see exactly what's going on until you're in that state yourself. It's not imaginable. And for instance, the biggest split amongst the Sunnis in the subcontinent, which is the Brailvi Deobandi split, largely about these hazir nazir things about the spirit of the Holy Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam. Classical Islam says these are all possible interpretations. You'll never resolve it, let alone successfully impose a single view on the entirety of the ulama. So don't try. So this is an important wisdom, and things like the visiting of the graves and what happens in graves. The only rule that I've heard amongst the ulama is that if you're doubtful about a practice, don't do it, and then you'll keep yourself safe. But don't start attacking people because they have different aqa'id. If they're following a fatwa from a legitimate authority, fine. Shaykh al-Azhar and the previous Shaykh al-Azhar, Mufti of Egypt, Shaykh Muhammad Hassan Makhluf, had a long fatwa about how the saints can intercede for us, and they still have the honour of being able to pray for people, even though they won't receive an ajr for it in their grave. That's a view amongst the ulama, so don't start hyperventilating if people believe that they're in some kind of communion with the dead, because there's ulama who will accept that. And we should not be tearing ourselves apart as an ummah when there's other stuff going on in the world over those issues which cannot be resolved. So that's another thing that I've heard from some of the ulama. Shaykh Abdal Hakim, for instance, is often talking about this, how we think that we can resolve in our mind's eye the state of the dead and polemicize against other sorts of Muslims because we think we know what the dead person is going to, what he can or can't do. These are ghaibiyat, and the ulama, people of tawsi'ah in these issues. Okay, so we've dealt with most of the key preliminary matters. Just to look at the history of it, which I think is interesting. Islam emerges unusually amongst world religions in an extremely adversarial and unfriendly environment. Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam emerges in 1st century Palestine, where just about everybody is Jewish anyway. They know the monotheistic story that he's telling them. He is tweaking an existing narrative. The Buddha appears in India, in an Indic environment, where people already know most of the teachings about Dharma and reincarnation that he is confirming, and he's changing certain things. Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam comes in that desert town in 7th century Arabia, and the people really are believing the exact opposite of what Abrahamic believers are supposed to believe. They don't have a law, they don't have a universal rule of ethics. For them, you just act in the interests of the tribe, and vendetta is the basis for justice in Arabia. They believe in lots of gods and some vague conception of a sky god that in some rather loose way presides over everything. And they don't have a belief in life after death. It's an interesting reminder of the magnitude of the prophetic revolution, that he takes them from one point of the religious spectrum really to the other, to the opposite end. Polytheism to a strict monotheism, from having no universal ethics to having the Sharia and the universal system of akhlaq, from having no notion of life after death to having the Quran, which is really focused on life after death, much more than the biblical text even. It's extraordinary, but it's a historical fact. So the Quran contains a lot about the meaning of human life, where we're going, the direction, tell us, the ma'ad. And some of the very earliest verses to be revealed are specifically about time doesn't go on forever, there will be the end of time, the last trump, and the physical laws of the cosmos are going to look particularly weird. God can do what he likes with them, having set up those laws in the first place. He can do what he likes, and towards the end of time there will be a kind of shift in the rules of physics. And death, resurrection, judgment, heaven, hell are amongst the earliest of the themes in the Meccan period, and we know that that was not well received, particularly since the text pulls no punches in terms of its direction. It's talking to the plutocrats of Mecca, to the exploitative practices of the Meccan elite, to their use of usury, sharp commercial practice, their indifference to the poor, to the weak, to the orphan, to the widow, all of those categories. This is the warning. Waylun lakum, woe betide you, is the Quran's message to its own people. So this radicalism of the Quran is focused on its idea of time. And it's quite easy to reconstruct the worldview of the Meccan elite from the Quran's polemic against them. So for instance, so many verses, وَأَقْسَمُوا بِاللَّهِ جَهْدَ أَيْمَانِهِمْ لَا يَبْعَثُ اللَّهُ مَنْ يَمُوتُ بَلَا وَعْدًا عَلَيْهِ حَقًّا وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. They swear by God to the extent, with the greatest oath they can, that God will never resurrect those who die. بَلَا وَعْدًا عَلَيْهِ حَقًّا. On the contrary, it is his promise, his true promise, that most people do not know. يقولون أئنا لمردودون في الحافرة أئذا كنا عظاما نخرة قالوا تلك إذا كرة خاسرة. They say, are we going to be brought back again after we've turned into rotten bones? And they say that will be a futile return, a futile outcome. So these explicit terms, the Quran itself is explaining the incredulity with which its central message was being met. The Meccan elite had no belief in life after death, unusually amongst traditional peoples. They didn't think they were going to ascend and become stars amongst their ancestors, or that they were going to turn into animals or be reincarnated or anything at all. They had a rather dark, pessimistic, rather modern view. وَمَا يُهْلِكُنَا إِلَّا الدَّهْرُ. We live and we die, and only time destroys us. And that was their view. Dahr. One of the words for atheist or materialist in modern Arabic is dahriya. People who believe that time and space is all there is. And that's exactly how the pagan Arabs were, which gives the Quranic polemic a kind of modern edge. It's not like, say, early Christian polemic against Judaism, paganism and so forth, where the assumption is that of course we have immortal souls and that's what we really are. There's something rather modern about the Qur'an's theistic polemic against pagan, not atheistic, but certainly extremely dark and pessimistic view that it's just fate that destroys us, we'll turn into rotten bones. It could well be that this is one reason for the ongoing appeal and attractiveness of the text, that there is a certain curious, unexpected convergence between the ethos of 7th century Mecca and, say, 21st century Wall Street. Why is it that the mosques still fall? Well, maybe it's that the Qur'an is articulating something that presses all of our buttons, despite being from apparently a very different time and space. After all, who runs today's world? Well, it's the banks, it's the rulers, it's the media moguls, Qur'an, that would be the poets, the pagan poets. We seem to be back there. Usury rules the world. The poor become poorer. The gulf between rich and poor is, as the bishops noted last week, outrageous. In this rich country, we have 500,000 people going to food banks. A lot of people, especially single mothers and the weak, they go to the wall despite the billions we pour into social services. God knows what would happen if we didn't have the economy that could support that. It doesn't bear thinking about the old, by and large, ignored, neglected, pushed away. Does look rather similar. And it's just dahr. We live, we die, only dahr destroys us. And as for resurrection, لا يبعث الله من يموت. That's exactly what they say. The Qur'an here exactly mirrors what the atheists of the age seem to be saying. When we're going to be rotten bones, that's what I will be in 50 years' time. They think there's rotten bones. Nothing more. Nothing will survive, except perhaps if people are still reading my interesting monograph on microbiology. That's where I'll find my immortality. Maybe my children will remember me, but even today, kids are not what they used to be. But rotten bones. So I might propose that as an explanation for the ongoing resonance that the Qur'an has, that there's something Qurashi about Madison Avenue and Wall Street, and the polemic of the Qur'an still has teeth. But the Qur'an, Rosalind Gwynn has this interesting book on God's Arguments, which is an American academic, and she locates the Qur'an's sort of 30 major logical structures where it's constructing its arguments, and many of them are to do with refuting this pagan idea that we can't possibly come back to life again. That's kind of ridiculous. That's a false analogy with the seasons. So, for instance, Surah Al-Hajj, I'll just read the English. O men, if ye be in doubt concerning the resurrection, consider that we first created you of the dust of the ground, afterwards of seed, afterwards of a little coagulated blood, afterwards of a piece of flesh, perfectly formed in part, and in part imperfectly formed, that we might make our power manifest unto you, and we cause that which we please to rest in the wombs until the appointed time. Then we bring you forth infants, and afterwards we permit you to attain your age of full strength, and one of you dieth in his youth, and another of you is postponed to a decrepit age, so that he forgetteth whatever he knew. So the point of the Quranic argument here is to say, and again it's quite characteristic of the sort of arguments that you'll get later in the Kalam polemic against materialists, is that your existence is a lot weirder than the idea that one day that existence will be re-established. The fact that there is anything out there is already the greatest improbability ever. And the weirdest thing of all about space and time is that there is consciousness within it, and that we can talk about space and time, and that we can have this conversation. That's really strange. God can do that. You know that it exists because it's your reality. So don't pour scorn on the idea that he can do it again, that there can be an alternative universe, a different transformed universe in which certain archetypes are visible rather than half buried. And this is the Quranic argument. And then we get other things. For instance, thou seest the earth sometimes dried up and barren, but when we send down rain thereon, It is put in motion and swelleth, and produceth every kind of luxuriant vegetable. This showeth that God is the truth, and that he raiseth the dead to life, and that he is almighty, and that the hour of judgment will surely come, there is no doubt thereof, and God will raise again those who are in the graves. So, this is an analogy, a parallel. It is not seeking to demonstrate through some kind of logic chopping or syllogism that heaven and hell exists. It is pouring scorn on those who pour scorn on the possibility. This is characteristic of the Quranic discourse. The Quran is not a theology manual. It doesn't set out to prove things through some form of clever juggling with words or debating tricks. Instead, its appeal is not to the superficial ratiocinative part of the mind, with all of the tricks that it plays, and the futility of much of its activities. If you look at how many questions in philosophy have actually ever been resolved, well, we're still arguing about the things Plato was arguing about. But it goes deeper, to a different level. And what is that level? Well, the Quran says that it is sent to ulul albab, people of lub. What is lub? Lub doesn't really mean intellect or aql, even if you translate intellect as aql. Lub is something deeper. Lub is something closer to that mystery which is beyond articulation, which is the mystery of selfhood or consciousness itself. That begins at, think back to your early memories, it is there intact as selfhood at a very early age. You may not know anything, you may cry when you see a dog, whatever your first memory is, but it is the self. It is you in your fullness, in your integrity. That is what it is appealing to. So, when we read Revelation, we are not reading any other type of text. Instead, what we are hearing is something that trickles down, like the rain, to the deepest levels of consciousness itself. It's not even poetical, it's not even musical, although the Quran has dimensions that are often compared to poetry or music, but it's not that. It goes in much more deeply, and it activates certain intuitions. It's like seeds that are brought to life, certain things that are intrinsic in the human persona which are waiting to come to the surface. And this is God's signs. The verses of the Quran are not described as proofs, they're described as signs. A sign is not a proof, a sign is an indication, a pointer. Look in that direction and see where you go. But it's not a description of how you get there or what's there. The Quran is divided into ayat. But there's another register in which God discloses himself, which is the register of nature, general revelation in nature. إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Truly, in the creation of the heaven and the earth and the succession of night and day are signs for people of albab. Again, that word, lub, the inner core, not the mind, the deeper thing, consciousness itself, but that mystery. مَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. You've been given little knowledge, but whatever it is that's the mystery of cognition itself, that's what nature is speaking to. Now, what could that mean? Well, the Quran does not supply arguments for the existence of God in the conventional sense, cosmological or ontological or whatever it might be. It's not that kind of text. Instead, what it does is to show us signs and to invite us to look at them so that something within us, which is not merely rational, is activated. And to make any sense of that, you have to intuit that there is more to us than synapses in the brain or the capacity to do things in laboratories or to write equations on a board. The Quran's assurance is that we are more than all of those things, and that there is this lub, this seed deep within that is waiting for this water so that it can become itself. How does that work? It works through stillness and contemplation, and through self-knowledge. Part of the problem that the moderns have with religion, it seems to me, is not that they don't have the opportunity to see lots of God's signs with the Hubble Space Telescope, shows us some pretty amazing things. But that we are so rushed and stressed and moving from pleasure to pleasure or duty to duty and text to text, or whatever it might be, that stillness, which is the precondition for the correct operation of the Ruach and the Spirit, just never happens. We're always stressed. There's always something new to do. There's a new email. We fill our moments, and our employers are very happy to do that for us. And the entertainment industry is very happy to make money out of our determination to do that. Our hours are just stuffed, packed with pleasures, responsibilities, emails, and we don't get that stillness, which allows this lub to be active. Without contemplation, without stillness, there is no disclosure, there's no revelation. The Holy Prophet, ﷺ, before the revelation comes, he is fi ghari Hira, he is in the cave of Hira, yatahannath. All the practices of religion are there in order to help you to know. Worship, yes, but know. The prayer is there to force you to stop texting just for 2 minutes so that you can kind of reawaken in some way as a human being. Body, mind and spirit, which are so ripped apart in the modern world, fused together. We do rip them apart. Because the body, you're in Sochi and what used to be Circassia. If it's the mind, you're in Cambridge. If it's the spirit, well, you don't do that so much nowadays, but maybe you do yoga or do mindfulness training, but it's really disaggregated. For the human capacity to know what's real, for the consciousness within really to be activated, those things have to come back together again. And the spiritual technology of Islam, which is the Sharia, if you like, is the outward form which enables the inward to become active once again. But the moderns, they often have not tasted anything like that. Sometimes they can have experiences or crises, and people can suddenly see something that perhaps they won't talk about, that slaps them around and brings them back to faith. Some people become great believers as a result of some intervention, but that's not common and it's not reliable. But generally people are just busy with little things, and the big things they have been programmed to regard as fictional or inaccessible. So the talk about human becoming, the immortality of the soul, the mystery of consciousness, and the fact that the archetypes which we glimpse in this world will be seen, as it were, at the surface level in the next world, is just weird talk, double Dutch to the modern mind. It just, like water off a duck's back, it just doesn't mean anything. It's just another story. So part of the problem that religion has is that we don't have the ability to help people to be still any longer and to be contemplative, because there's so much stuff going on. But how does that kind of help us to understand heaven and hell and make sense of the scriptural claims? Well, there's different ways of looking at this, but one helpful way is that which is proposed by some of our scholars, who would say that the world is nothing other than God doing an almost indefinite number of things, and separating the divine from the divine intention, and hence from what God does, is metaphysically a tricky thing. The world is the attributes of God. Not just what the attributes of God are doing, but is the attributes of God. And this is in the Ash'ari perspective in particular. So what we're looking at in the world is just God's uninterrupted, unobstructed agency. But the divine names, which weave together to form the fabric of the world, are, as we know, of two preponderant kinds. There are the names of Jamal, names of beauty, and there are the names of Jalal, the names of rigor. And that is the mysterium tremendum et fascinans in some Christian theology, when Blake left in the right hand of God. There is the fluffy, beautiful stuff, there is the scary stuff. There is the cute little baby, there's also the smallpox virus that kills the cute little baby, that's creation. There is rigor and terrifying things and exploding galaxies, but there's also beauty, gentleness, compassion, tenderness, probably in the middle of this universe of clashing extreme temperatures and forces. There is a mother's love for the baby, there is Shakespeare, there is that in the midst of the wild, abrasive forces of nature in the raw. So there is the beauty and there is the rigor. Everything in the world is just those things coming together in endless combinations. When time, because that again in our metaphysics is a relative category, relative because God is not subject to it and it's really part of human subjectivity. Even physicists, particularly if you're post-Einsteinian, will say, well, it's relative, it's not what we think it is. When time comes to an end, Akhir al-Zaman, the end of time, the last day, after that, according to this traditional image, that combination of the rigor and the beauty, or you might say the fiery stuff that consumes and hurts us, and the garden stuff that brings us peace and helps us to flourish ourselves, those are separated out. This world, they're mixed together in this incredibly complex thing called space and time. The next world, after, again, the end of time, they separate out. And this is what in the traditional language is called the fire of the garden. Those two are separated. And that which in this world was of its nature fiery, including those souls that in this world were fiery and agitated, which means the vices, greed, envy, lust, the deadly sins, that is the natural context for those souls, because that is what, as the Quran says, مَا قَدَّمَتْ يَدَاكَ. Hell is what your hands have sent before you. You've made it for yourself. You chose fire in your soul. That's your reality, which you then see face to face after death in quote unquote eternity, time continuing after the end of time. Those who chose to make their hearts rawdatun min riyad al-jannah, those who were attracted to and fostered the beautiful, gentle things, the harmonious things, the things which flourish, they will also necessarily see the reality of that in the next world. And that is the traditional language of paradise. And this is what we understand by the divine justice. But it doesn't stop there, because the Mu'tazilites thought the system is just about the divine justice. It's like a cosmic justice machine. You put in a coin, which is your good work, and you get out a bit of paradise, and it's sort of mechanical. And sometimes the Indian religions can look like that. Everything is karmic. Suffering is karmic. It's just the consequence. And this ultimately not very theistic system of what you did to yourself or for yourself in a previous existence. The Mu'tazilites thought something like that, but Sunni Kalam says no, because the relationality between these two things, the fiery and the gardeny, the Jalal and the Jamal, is not an equivalence. Allah says, Sabaqat rahmati ghadabi, my mercy is prior to or takes precedence over my wrath. And we are told in the Sunni doctrine of the Shafa'ah, of the intercession, that people will come out of hell, nobody comes out of paradise. It's not a level playing field. And at the end of paradise itself, there is the وَلِلَّذِينَ أَحْسَنُوا الْحُسْنَى, to those who did what was good shall be the greatest good, وَزِيَادَةً, and even more. What is the greatest good once you have seen the archetypal reality of the mysterious forces of beauty and fruitfulness in this world? You've seen where it comes from and where it's going. What is higher than that? That is the final point of our doctrine of the afterlife, which is the ru'ya, which is the beatific vision, seeing God. Now again, our theologians kind of are staggered by this and say, well, how can you see God? The hadith is very clear. Mu'tazilites said, well, you can't do that. Your finite God is infinite. You haven't got the capacity to see an infinite entity. But the Ash'ari and the Maturidi ulama say God can create in our capacities of sight any ability he wishes, including the ability to perceive the infinity of the divine. And again, they use this phrase, a very wise phrase in our kalam, bila kayf, without how. So Bajuri says, وَمِنْهُ أَنْ يُنْظَرَ بِالْأَبْصَارِ وَلَكِنْ بِلَا كَيْفٍ وَلَا انْحِصَارٍ. And of our doctrine is that he will be seen with ocular sight, but without howness and without any limitation. So we won't see any boundaries to God, we will see boundaries to the other things that we see. and we don't know how it is. It's the amodal vision of God. This is, of course, one of the flagship doctrines of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So above the beauties and the pleasures of paradise, where everything that is good and pure in this world, including, of course, eros, that's there as well. Christians have a problem with that, but it's something that's true and beautiful in this world, and leads us on to an archetype that is paradisal. Beyond, higher, even than that, there is, as it were, the final return. And that really is where the story ends. Why is it a return, the final point of the Ma'ad? Because the beginning point was what? The day of Alastu bi Rabbikum. The first, as it were, conscious human thought or decision was on the day of the Mithaq, when we all said, Bala Shahidna, yes, we bear witness, in the presence of God. فَأَشْهَدَهُمْ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ. He caused us to witness about ourselves. When we were there, we couldn't help but say yes. So the ru'ya is the final confirmation for those who remember that in this world, that that's where you end up. So the whole system is symmetrical. But argument for it ultimately is the Quranic argument that this speaks to the heart. And it can only really be known and understood and figured out once you go there yourself, like so many other things. How do you describe what the moon looks like to a man born blind? Well, maybe if he gets the surgery, he can see what you're talking about. It's probably not really going to be what he thought you were talking about. But still, what you told him was correct. So this is the wisdom of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And I think that, like all good theology, it's epistemically humble. It says, well, so much of this is difficult to know. But it is important to know it because, after all, death lasts a long time. I've been told that my time has come to an end. So I don't know if the intention is to have questions now. Does anybody want to share that? Okay. Will you share it, or shall I just freelance? Okay. Any questions? Big subject. It's great if there are. It's been a long day. Yeah.
You have talked about having that lub, and that we need that stillness and thinking in order to connect with that lub and to kind of see what we are more than our intellect and emotions and whatever there is. But what is the key there? Which I'm supposing, because there's a lot of different ways of thinking and but there must be some kind of a different path there that will connect you. So I can't assume that it's just sitting down and thinking. In a lot of the ways of meditating, is it more like tafakkur? What's different? What is the path there, and what's different about that kind of?
It's when the soul is calm, so that the nafs is under control. Because where we make mistakes, morally or philosophically, is usually because the ego is getting in the way. And if you look at a lot of philosophers, you'll see that the choices between theories that they took were often egotistically motivated. They often have enormous egos, and they kind of are thrilled by the idea that they're being really controversial, or they're challenging some famous thinker, or they want to show off to their students. Or these huge planetary-sized egos. Even at the philosophy department here in Cambridge, there's big personalities. And that's exactly what the ancient Greeks said you should not do, because they had this idea that you had to purify the self before you could actually start thinking straight and knowing what was a good argument. Foucault, of all people, has this seminar which he calls Spirituality, where he says that what's characteristic about modern thought is that we no longer begin thinking by understanding ourselves and purifying ourselves some way or another, which he says goes right back to the ancient Greeks. Nowadays we just, and particularly for a French intellectual on the West Bank, it's all about kind of posing and being cool, and there's a lot of ego in philosophy. So yeah, you have to get rid of that before you can make balanced and sensible choices. And atheism is often, I think, motivated just by anger, resentment, people's self-image of themselves as being sort of cool or defiant or autonomous human beings. It's mostly motivated by ego rather than through people actually working conscientiously through the arguments. But ours is an age of ego, unfortunately. The ego is all that remains of us. Anyone else? Yeah, I see some hands going up. I think, yeah.
Can I just go back to the same question, but approach it from a different angle? On one hand, you say, and I think rightly, that we need this kind of state of stillness, right, to understand Islam, God, ourselves, and all that. On the other hand, we know that Islam kind of encourages people to go and live among people. It actually discourages people from kind of moving away from people and all that. So how would you reconcile these two notions?
Well, I mean, to use the traditional narrative, we are told that at the end times, it will be necessary to go into a retreat and to avoid society. يوشك أن يكون خير مال المسلم غنما يتبع به شعب الجبال ومواقع القطر يفر بدينه من الفتن. It's almost the time, Holy Prophet is saying, it's almost the time when the best thing a Muslim can own will be a flock of sheep with which he goes to the remote places in the mountains to flee with his religion from fitan, from fitna. So that's established as part of the correct pattern for Akhir Zaman. We don't know that we're there yet, but the point really is that one should maintain what the Naqshbandis call Khalwat Dar Anjuman, which is solitude in the crowd. So even if everybody is busy texting and being cool and distracted by a million things, you're still centered, self-aware, conscious of the needs of others, reflective, praying. So that you're in society, but you're not kind of just with the herd or following impressions like everybody else, but you're actually a conscious entity. So that's part of the gift of the prayer, which sort of kicks us out of whatever we think is important at the moment. It says, now you have to face Makkah and do what Muslims have always done, and there's no personality, individuality in it at all. You just have to surrender to the act, which is itself a khalwa. Fasting is another example. It's a radically anti-consumerist, anti-modern thing to do. So, yeah, I'm not suggesting we all go and live in caves at the moment. I don't think there are too many caves around Cambridge, even if we all decided this evening to do that. But the wisdom of the Sharia is that it does give us this actually quite substantial structure for our lives, which allows us regularly, inshallah 5 times a day, maybe more often, to recenter ourselves and to be detached. That's what Allahu Akbar means. Allahu Akbar is bigger than all of the other stuff. When you do this, you're pushing it all behind you. And that's what it means. The takbir is Allahu Akbar is bigger than all of that, bigger than the email, bigger than the match, even. And that's very impressive. But we know that we need it. Yeah. And we need to give it its due. The danger is always to kind of do it quickly, but even an extra minute on the prayer, this is kind of nasiha for the evening, even an extra minute for the prayer can turn it into something that's rushed and not very nice, into something that's dignified and beautiful. We can always spare an extra minute. Inshallah, we'll have that in yeah.
You talked a little bit about, touched on the frustration of teaching theology in the modern context.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any sense of that changing in any way, or what ways would you like to see it change?
Teaching theology in a university context, do you mean?
Yes.
It is difficult, and it's mostly the fault, I think, of the religions, because our co-religionists do so many outrageous things that young people switch off. They regard us as problematic, as limited. One can teach Islam, but unless you have a good way of explaining away the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, suicide bombing, manifest outrages, it's not very easy to get the message through to the young. Similarly, in the context of Christianity, child clerical abuses and a lot of other things that have been happening are deeply troubling to a lot of young people. A lot of young Jews are kind of quietly or publicly very unhappy at what's being done to the Palestinians. So if you can overcome those things, then I find a lot of young people are really interested and can hear the arguments of religion, but you need to remove the veil that is constituted by the religion's adherents themselves, unfortunately. It's not so easy. But this is not an inherently evil or blaspheming age, just an age in which people haven't heard about religion, they don't know what it is, and they don't even know the stories. I was should have left now so I can tell the story, teaching an undergraduate who's going to be an RE teacher. And we were going through the Quranic story of Jonah and the whale. And she said, "That's a really interesting story. Is it in the Bible as well?" She's an English girl. And this is a sort of fundamental cultural literacy, but it's gone. So the problem in the West is not, I think, that people have rejected religion, but that they've never really heard of it. Okay. Are we done? Okay.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but if any of you have any questions, I believe there are sheets under your seats, so if you have any questions, please write them on here and leave them on your seats, and hopefully the questions will be answered at the Gorilla Muslim event that will be later on during the week. Finally, on behalf of us all, I'd like to thank our Shaykh for sharing his knowledge with us all. And I would also like to remind you there will be an event every evening for Explore Islam Week. The next event will be a very interesting talk tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. on Moses, Jesus and Muhammad in Queen's Building, Emmanuel College. And now I have a few bits of information that I must tell you, otherwise I'll be told off. Please fill out the feedback forms that I believe are on your seats too. We'd really appreciate the feedback. And lastly, there are refreshments upstairs for you to enjoy, so please help yourselves, and thank you for listening.